Penelope Thorne stood frozen on the wooden platform, the weight of every stair in Sweetwater Creek bearing down upon her like the merciless Arizona sun. The year was 1885, and she had never felt more exposed in her 22 years of life. The town's first ever bachelor auction had been Mayor Wilkins' idea, a creative solution to raise funds for the new schoolhouse, while giving the unmarried women of the town a chance at companionship. But as the last unmarried woman called to bid, Penelope knew the real reason she'd been included was for the townsfolk's amusement. "Come now, ladies, don't be shy," Mayor Wilkins called out, his portly frame vibrating with enthusiasm as he gestured to the line of eligible men standing proudly on the makeshift stage. "Remember, all proceeds go to our children's education." The crowd of nearly 200 townsfolk erupted in laughter and applause. They had gathered in the town square, normally reserved for holiday celebrations and the occasional hanging. Today, however, it was festooned with colorful bunting and paper lanterns for the auction. Penelope's fingers tightened around her small coin purse. Inside were her life savings, $8.37. She'd been working as the town's assistant seamstress since her parents died in the typhoid outbreak 4 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was everything she had. "Now then, Miss Thorne, it's your turn to bid," Mayor Wilkins announced, his voice carrying across the square. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by scattered chuckles. Penelope felt her cheeks flame. As the plainest woman in Sweetwater Creek, with her too tall frame, unruly auburn hair, and face spattered with freckles, she knew what they expected. For her to stammer, to fail, to slink away in shame as she had done so many times before. Her voice caught, betraying her. The laughter grew. That's when she saw him, standing apart from the other men, leaning against the corner of the general store with arms folded across his chest. Unlike the others, he wasn't preening or posturing. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn Stetson, but Penelope could feel his eyes on her. $1, she finally said, her voice barely audible. "Did you say $1, Miss Thorne?" Mayor Wilkins cupped his ear dramatically, inciting more laughter. $1, she repeated, louder this time, nodding toward Tommy Jenkins, the blacksmith's gangly son who'd been passed over by every other woman in town. $1 for young Mr. Jenkins. Do I hear $2? The mayor looked around expectantly, but everyone knew Tommy wasn't worth bidding on. His face was scarred from a childhood accident, and he stuttered so badly most people avoided conversation with him altogether. Going once, going twice, $10. The deep voice cut through the square like a knife. The crowd parted as Kade Blackwell stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled at the nape of his neck. He was a newcomer to Sweetwater Creek, having arrived just 3 months prior to take over the vacant ranch at the edge of town. Rumors swirled about him that he'd been a gunslinger, a lawman, or even an outlaw with a price on his head. All anyone knew for certain was that he kept to himself and had more money than most in the struggling town. $10. Mayor Wilkins' eyes widened to the size of saucers. "For which gentleman are you bidding, Mr. Blackwell?" "I'm not." Kade's boots thudded heavily on the wooden platform as he climbed up, standing before the crowd. His eyes, the color of steel, found Penelope's. "I'm offering myself up for bid, and I'm bidding $10 on the lady." The crowd erupted into confused murmurs. This wasn't how the auction was supposed to work. "Well, that is to say." Mayor Wilkins fumbled with his pocket watch, clearly flustered. $15, Kade continued, his gaze never leaving Penelope's face. "For the privilege of escorting Miss Thorne to the Founders' Day dance this Saturday." Penelope's breath caught in her throat. The Founders' Day dance was the most important social event of the year, She'd never attended with a gentleman caller, had never been asked. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm afraid you've misunderstood the nature of our auction," the mayor sputtered. $20. Kade pulled out a leather wallet and counted out the bills, placing them in the collection tin. It was more money than most in Sweetwater Creek saw in months. Unless anyone else would like to bid higher for the ladies' company, the crowd fell silent. Penelope stood rooted to the spot, unable to believe what was happening. Was this some elaborate joke at her expense? But there was nothing in Kade Blackwell's expression to suggest mockery, only determination. "Well then," Mayor Wilkins finally recovered, clearing his throat. "It seems we have an unusual turn of events. $20 for Miss Thorne from Mr. Blackwell. Going once, going twice. Sold." As the gavel struck, sealing their fate, Penelope realized two things simultaneously. Kade Blackwell had just saved her from public humiliation, and every person in Sweetwater Creek would now be watching their every move. Miss Thorne. Kade crossed the platform to stand before her, extending his hand. His palm was calloused from hard work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "May I escort you home?" Unable to form words, Penelope nodded, placing her trembling fingers in his. As he led her through the parting crowd, past the astonished faces and whispered comments, she struggled to make sense of what had just happened. "Why did you do that?" she finally managed to ask when they were safely away from the bulk of the crowd. Kade Blackwell's lips curved into a slight smile, the first she'd ever seen on his usually stern face. "Because some treasures are overlooked by those too blind to recognize their value." The walk to Penelope's small cottage on the edge of town seemed both interminable and far too brief. Word of Kade's unprecedented bid spread through Sweetwater Creek like wildfire, and by the time they reached her front porch, curious eyes peered from behind curtains up and down the street. "Thank you for seeing me home, Mr. Blackwell," Penelope said formally, fishing in her reticule for her door key. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Kade," he corrected. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Thorne." "Penelope," she offered in return, finally meeting his eyes directly for the first time. They weren't simply gray as she'd first thought, but contained flecks of blue like the sky reflected in river water. "Penelope." The way he said her name made it sound like something precious. "I'll call for you at 6 on Saturday evening." "You don't have to go through with this," she blurted out, clutching her key tightly. "You've made your point, whatever it was. The town has had its entertainment. You needn't waste your evening at the dance with me." Kade's expression hardened. "Is that what you think this is? Entertainment?" "What else could it be?" Penelope's voice dropped to a whisper. "Look at me, Mr. Blackwell Kade. I'm not the sort of woman men bid on at auctions. I'm not the sort men notice at all except to laugh at." He stepped closer, and Penelope caught the scent of leather and pine. "Perhaps you've been surrounded by fools your entire life." Before she could respond, he took her free hand and raised it to his lips, brushing a kiss across her knuckles that sent a shock through her entire body. "Saturday at 6, Penelope Thorne. Wear something that matches those remarkable eyes of yours." He was gone before she could tell him her eyes were merely brown, nothing remarkable about them at all. Penelope stood on her porch long after he'd disappeared down the dusty street, wondering if she'd somehow stumbled into someone else's life. Inside her cottage, Penelope leaned against the closed door and tried to steady her racing heart. The small two-room structure had been left to her by her parents, and while modest, it was all hers. She'd managed to keep it through 4 years of hard work, taking and mending and helping Mrs. Hollister with dress orders for the wealthier women in town. Moving to her bedroom, Penelope caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. What had Kade Blackwell seen when he looked at her? Certainly not what she saw. A too thin woman with unruly auburn hair that refused to stay pinned, a smattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks, and plain brown eyes that were her only unremarkable feature. With trembling fingers, she opened the trunk at the foot of her bed. Inside lay her mother's blue dress, the only fine garment she owned. She hadn't worn it since the funeral 4 years ago. It would need altering to fit her taller frame, but with her skills as a seamstress, she could manage before Saturday. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Hastily closing the trunk, Penelope smoothed her skirts and went to answer it. Mabel Watson, the town's most notorious gossip, stood on her porch wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Behind her were Clara Jenkins and Sarah Peterson, 2 women Penelope had known since childhood but who had scarcely spoken to her in years. "Penelope, darling," Mabel exclaimed, as if they were the closest of friends. "We simply had to come check on you after all the excitement." "I'm quite well, thank you," Penelope replied cautiously, not opening the door wider to invite them in. "Kade Blackwell," Clara breathed, her eyes wide. "Do you know him? Had you arranged this beforehand?" "No, $20, Sarah interjected. "My Henry doesn't make that in a week at the mill." Mabel leaned forward conspiratorially. "What did he say to you?" "Everyone's talking about it. Mrs. Hollister says he must have lost a bet. Reverend Porter thinks he's trying to improve his standing in the community with an act of charity." Penelope's momentary confidence crumbled. Of course that's what they all thought. What other explanation could there be? "If you'll excuse me, ladies," she said quietly. "I have work to finish before dark." She closed the door on their protests, sliding down to sit on the floor with her back against it. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away furiously. She would not cry over the opinions of people who had never shown her kindness. Instead, she got to her feet and went to her sewing basket. If Kade Blackwell was determined to escort her to the Founders' Day dance, whether from kindness, pity, or some unknowable motive, she would at least ensure she didn't embarrass him further. The next morning, Penelope was threading her needle to begin work on altering her mother's dress when another knock sounded at her door. Sighing, she set aside her work, expecting to find more curious townsfolk on her porch. Instead, Mrs. Hollister stood there, arms laden with parcels. "Good morning, Penelope," the older woman said briskly. "May I come in?" Mrs. Hollister was Sweetwater Creek's premier dressmaker and Penelope's employer. A widow of 15 years, she ran her business with an iron hand but had always treated Penelope fairly, if not warmly. "Of course." Penelope stepped aside, curious. The older woman bustled in, placing her packages on Penelope's small dining table. "I've brought your week's work," she explained, unwrapping the largest bundle to reveal several lengths of fabric. "Mrs. Ferguson needs her daughter's coming-out gown by the end of the month, and the Wilkins girls each need new dresses for the Founders' Day festivities." "I'll start right away," Penelope assured her, reaching for the patterns tucked between the fabric layers. "That's not all, Mrs. Hollister fixed her with an appraising look. "I understand you'll be attending the dance yourself this year." Heat rushed to Penelope's cheeks. Yes, with Kade Blackwell." "Yes," Mrs. Hollister nodded decisively. "You can't wear that old blue dress of your mother's. It's at least 10 years out of fashion." Penelope blinked in surprise. "How did you?" "I knew your mother well, girl. She was a fine woman, and that was a fine dress in its day." The dressmaker's expression softened slightly. "But you need something that will turn heads for the right reasons." From another package, Mrs. Hollister withdrew a length of emerald green silk that made Penelope gasp. "This came in last month from back east. I've been saving it for the right customer." She placed it in Penelope's hands. It will bring out the auburn in your hair and make those eyes of yours shine like amber in sunlight." "Mrs. Hollister, I could never afford. Consider it an advance on your wages," the woman interrupted. "You've been my most reliable help for 4 years, Penelope Thorne. Never late, never complaining, never a stitch out of place. It's high time someone in this town recognized your worth beyond your needle skills." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes as she stroked the luxurious fabric. "Thank you," she whispered, "Mrs." Hollister nodded, her usual stern demeanor returning. "Come to the shop this afternoon. We'll take your measurements and start cutting. If Kade Blackwell is going to cause such a stir over you, we might as well give the gossip something substantial to talk about." After the dressmaker left, Penelope sat for a long time with the green silk in her lap, wondering how her life had changed so dramatically in less than a day. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel a tiny flicker of hope. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Between her regular sewing work and fittings for her new dress at Mrs. Hollister's shop, Penelope scarcely had time to worry about the upcoming dance or what might happen afterward, when Kade Blackwell's inexplicable interest inevitably waned. She didn't see him during those days, though she heard plenty about him. According to town gossip, he'd been busy at his ranch, preparing for a cattle drive scheduled for the following month. Some said he'd hired extra hands, others that he'd purchased adjacent land from Old Man Jenkins. No one seemed to know anything for certain about his past or what had brought him to Sweetwater Creek, which only fueled the speculation. By Friday afternoon, Penelope's dress was complete, and the result nearly brought her to tears when she saw herself in Mrs. Hollister's full-length mirror. The emerald silk complemented her coloring perfectly, making her skin glow and her eyes appear almost golden. The bodice was fitted to emphasize her slender waist, while clever draping disguised her angular shoulders and modest bosom. "You look beautiful, child, Mrs. Hollister said softly, adjusting the bustle. "Like your mother in her prime, but with your own fire." Penelope hardly recognized herself. "Will it be enough?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. The dressmaker met her eyes in the mirror. "Enough for what? For him? For them?" She shook her head. "The question is whether it's enough for you, Penelope. Do you feel beautiful?" For the first time in her life, Penelope thought perhaps she did. She returned home with her dress carefully wrapped, only to find another surprise waiting. On her porch sat a small wooden crate with a note attached. "For tomorrow evening. KB." Inside the crate, nestled in straw, was a pair of dancing slippers made of soft leather dyed to match her dress perfectly, along with a small bottle of lavender perfume from the mercantile. How had he known the color of her dress? Had Mrs. Hollister told him? And how had he guessed her shoe size? The mystery of Kade Blackwell only deepened, and with it, Penelope's anxiety about the following evening. Saturday arrived with agonizing slowness. Penelope spent the morning cleaning her cottage until it gleamed, then heated water for a proper bath, washing her hair and scenting it with the lavender perfume. She spent an unprecedented amount of time arranging her auburn locks, finally managing to tame them into an elegant chignon with soft tendrils framing her face. As 6 o'clock approached, her stomach knotted with nerves. What if he didn't come? What if this had all been an elaborate prank? What if he took one look at her and regretted his impulsive bid at the auction? At precisely 6, a knock sounded at her door. Taking a deep breath, Penelope crossed the room on trembling legs and opened it. Kade Blackwell stood on her porch, and the sight of him stole her breath away. He wore a black frock coat over a crisp white shirt, his string tie perfectly knotted. His dark hair was neatly combed, though one rebellious curl fell over his forehead. In his hands he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Penelope," he said, his voice low and warm. His eyes traveled over her, taking in the green silk dress, her arranged hair, the dancing slippers on her feet. "You look." He seemed genuinely at a loss for words, which gave Penelope a tiny surge of confidence. "Thank you for the slippers," she said, accepting the wildflowers. "They're perfect. How did you know?" A smile quirked one corner of his mouth. "I have my sources. Mrs. Hollister," she guessed, breathing in the sweet scent of the flowers. "Among others." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The walk to the town hall where the dance was being held felt both interminable and far too short. Penelope was acutely aware of the eyes watching from windows and porches as they passed. "Everyone is staring," she murmured. "Let them," Kade replied, covering her hand on his arm with his own. "They've little enough entertainment in this town." "Is that what we are? Entertainment?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "No, Penelope, that's not what we are at all." Something in his eyes made her heart skip a beat, but before she could ask what he meant, they had arrived at the town hall, its windows blazing with light and the sounds of the small orchestra drifting out into the evening air. Mayor Wilkins himself greeted them at the door, his face flushed with the exertion of his official duties, or perhaps from the flask he kept slipping from when he thought no one was looking. "Mr. Blackwell, Miss Thorne," he boomed far too loudly. "Welcome, welcome, quite the couple you make." Penelope felt herself blush to the roots of her hair, but Kade merely inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement before guiding her inside. The town hall had been transformed. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Tables laden with food and punch lined one wall, while the orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end. Nearly everyone in Sweetwater Creek had turned out for the occasion, dressed in their finest. As Penelope and Kade entered, a hush fell over the room, followed immediately by a buzz of whispers. "Ignore them," Kade murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Would you care to dance?" Without waiting for her answer, he led her onto the dance floor just as the orchestra began a waltz. Penelope had learned to dance as a girl, but it had been years since she'd had the opportunity to practice. To her surprise, her body remembered the steps, and Kade proved to be an excellent lead, guiding her with confidence. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, amazed at how easily they moved together. "My mother insisted," he replied, a shadow crossing his features briefly. "She said no son of hers would disgrace her at social gatherings." "She sounds formidable." She was. His expression softened. "She died when I was 16. Influenza." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly. "I lost my parents to typhoid 4 years ago. I know." She looked up at him in surprise. "You know?" "I make it my business to know about the people who interest me, Penelope Thorne." Before she could respond, the waltz ended, and they were immediately surrounded by curious townspeople. For the next hour, Penelope found herself introduced to people she'd known her entire life, but who had scarcely acknowledged her existence before. Women who had previously looked through her now smiled and complimented her dress. Men who had never noticed her now asked for dances, which Kade graciously allowed, though he never strayed far from her side. It was dizzying and confusing. Penelope knew their sudden interest had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the mysterious man who had chosen her. But she couldn't help enjoying the novel experience of being the center of attention for reasons other than ridicule. After a particularly vigorous reel with the blacksmith's son Tommy, who proved to be an enthusiastic if somewhat clumsy dancer, Penelope found herself breathless and flushed. "Would you like some air?" Kade appeared at her side, offering his arm once more. "Yes, please," she agreed gratefully. He led her through the crowd to a side door that opened onto a small garden area behind the town hall. A few lanterns illuminated the space, but it was blissfully quiet compared to the cacophony inside. Penelope breathed deeply, letting the cool night air wash over her heated skin. "Thank you." It was becoming a bit overwhelming. "You're the talk of the town," Kade observed, leaning against the garden wall beside her. "No, you are." She gave him a wry smile. "I'm merely an accessory to the mystery." "Is that what you think?" He turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "What else would I think? 3 days ago I was invisible to these people. Now they can't seem to get enough of me, and it's only because of you." She shook her head. "I don't understand why you did it, Kade, why you singled me out." For a long moment he was silent, studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "The first day I arrived in Sweetwater Creek," he finally said, "I stopped at the general store for supplies. You were there, helping an elderly woman select fabric. Do you remember?" Penelope thought back. Mrs. Abernathy. She needed material for her grandson's christening gown. He nodded. "You spent nearly an hour with her, showing her every white fabric in the store, offering suggestions, listening to stories about her children and grandchildren. You were patient and kind, even when she changed her mind 3 times. She's lonely," Penelope said simply. "Her family rarely visits." Then there was the Sunday after that, when Reverend Porter's sermon ran long and half the congregation was dozing in the heat. You were the only one who noticed when little Alice Miller began having an asthma attack in the back pew. You slipped out and returned with her medicine before her own parents realized anything was wrong. Penelope stared at him, stunned. "You noticed all that?" "I notice everything about you, Penelope Thorne." He took a step closer. "I've watched you mend Mrs. Watson's daughter's dress 3 times in a month without charging her extra, even though everyone knows the girl is careless with her clothes. I've seen you leave food on the Jenkins porch when Tommy's father drinks away their money." His voice grew softer. "I've observed how you carry yourself straight-backed and dignified despite the whispers and dismissals. How you smile at children and old folks, but keep your eyes down around others to avoid seeing their indifference. How you work harder than anyone else in this town, but never complain." Penelope's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Why would you pay attention to such things?" "Because from the moment I saw you, I couldn't look away." Kade reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "When I heard about the bachelor auction and that you were to participate, I knew I couldn't let them humiliate you. Not when you've shown more strength and character than the rest of this town combined." A single tear escaped, trailing down Penelope's cheek. Kade caught it with his thumb, his touch infinitely tender. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he replied. "I'd like to know more if you'll let me." The music from inside changed to a slower waltz, the melody drifting out to them on the night air. "Dance with me, Penelope," Kade said softly, taking her hand. "Not for them, but for us." And there in the moonlit garden, away from the prying eyes of Sweetwater Creek, Penelope Thorne danced in the arms of a man who had seen her when no one else did and found her beautiful. As they swayed together, Penelope felt the walls around her heart beginning to crumble. For 4 years, she had lived in isolation, protected by her invisibility. Now Kade Blackwell had shone a light on her, exposing her to both the warmth of attention and the potential burn of disappointment. "What happens after tonight?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the music. Kade's arms tightened slightly around her. "What would you like to happen?" "I don't know," she admitted. "This doesn't feel real. Tomorrow I'll go back to being Penelope Thorne, the seamstress whom everyone overlooks." "Not everyone," he corrected. "Never again." The music ended, and they stood still in the garden, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. From inside came the sound of the mayor calling for attention, It was time for the traditional Founders' Day speech, followed by the midnight supper. "We should go back in," Penelope said reluctantly. Kade nodded, offering his arm once more. As they re-entered the hall, Penelope noticed the stairs had changed. There was curiosity still, yes, but also something else, a kind of grudging re-evaluation, as if the townsfolk were seeing her through new eyes. Mayor Wilkins droned on about the founding of Sweetwater Creek 40 years earlier, the hardships faced by the original settlers, and the bright future ahead for the growing town. Penelope barely heard him, too aware of Kade standing beside her, his arm occasionally brushing against hers, sending sparks through her entire body. Finally, the speech concluded, and the crowd moved toward the supper tables. As they joined the line, Mabel Watson approached them, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Penelope, dear, you must be simply exhausted from all the dancing," she gushed. "And Mr. Blackwell, how gallant you've been. Everyone is saying you two make the most unexpected couple, Mrs. Watson," Kade responded smoothly. "Miss Thorne is indeed a surprising woman. I'm fortunate she's allowing me to escort her this evening." Mabel tittered, clearly fishing for more information. "And how did you two become acquainted? Penelope is so private, she scarcely socializes at all." Before Penelope could feel embarrassment at this assessment, Kade replied, "Some treasures are found when one is not actively searching, Mrs. Watson. I consider myself fortunate to have discovered Miss Thorne's acquaintance." He guided Penelope away, leaving Mabel blinking in confusion. "You have a gift for handling difficult people," Penelope observed as they filled their plates with fried chicken, corn pudding, and fresh bread. "A necessary skill in my line of work," he replied. "And what is your line of work exactly? Everyone has a different theory." She lowered her voice. "Mrs. Peterson at the Mercantile is convinced you're a fugitive hiding from the law." Amusement flickered in Kade's eyes. "And what do you think I am, Penelope?" She studied him for a moment. "I think you're a man who values his privacy, just as I do. Whatever you were before coming to Sweetwater Creek doesn't matter to me." Something in his expression softened. "I was a lawman for a time, a U.S. Marshal in the New Mexico Territory. I resigned my badge after." He hesitated. "After I failed to protect someone I'd sworn to keep safe." The shadow she'd glimpsed earlier returned to his features, and Penelope instinctively placed her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry." He covered her hand with his. "The past is done. I came to Arizona to start fresh, to build something that would last. Your ranch, that's part of it." His eyes held hers. "But a man needs more than land and cattle to build a life worth living." The implications of his words hung between them, charged with possibility. Before Penelope could respond, Sheriff Miller approached their table, nodding respectfully. "Evening, Miss Thorne. Mr. Blackwell." The sheriff was a solid man in his 50s who had known Penelope since she was a child. "Fine night for a dance." "Indeed, Sheriff," Kade replied, shaking the man's offered hand. "Been meaning to speak with you, Blackwell. Heard you're looking to expand your operation. Might have some information about land opening up south of the creek." The sheriff glanced at Penelope. "Begging your pardon, Miss Thorne, for the business talk." "Not at all, Sheriff," she replied. "Perhaps we could discuss it Monday at your office," Kade suggested. "I don't wish to neglect my companion this evening." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "Monday it is, then. Enjoy your evening, folks." As the night progressed, Penelope found herself relaxing more and more in Kade's company. They danced, they talked, they laughed, and gradually, the stares of the townspeople became less important. For the first time in years, Penelope felt truly seen, not as the orphaned seamstress to be pitied or ignored, but as a woman worthy of attention and respect. When midnight struck, and the orchestra played their final notes, Penelope felt a curious mixture of elation and regret. The most magical night of her life was ending, and she had no idea what the dawn would bring. Kade escorted her home through the quiet streets of Sweetwater Creek. A few revelers were still making their way from the town hall, calls of goodnight echoing in the darkness. The moon was high and full, casting silver light over the town. "Thank you," Penelope said as they approached her cottage, "for everything." "The pleasure was mine," Kade replied, his voice low in the stillness. They reached her porch and Penelope turned to face him, suddenly shy again. Would you like to come in for coffee? It's late, I know, but I'd like that very much," he interrupted gently. Inside, Penelope lit the lamps and busied herself with the coffee pot, acutely aware of Kade's presence in her small home. He moved to the mantelpiece, studying the daguerreotype of her parents that rested there. "You have your mother's profile," he observed, "and your father's eyes." "You're the first person to ever say that," Penelope replied, setting the coffee to boil on the stove. "Most people just say I don't resemble either of them. Most people don't look closely enough." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Penelope, there's something I need to tell you." Her heart stuttered. "Yes, my coming to Sweetwater Creek wasn't entirely by chance." He took a deep breath. "Your father and mine were friends years ago. They served together in the war." Penelope stared at him, uncomprehending. "My father never mentioned a Blackwell." "My father's name was Jonathan Barrett. He died when I was 12. My mother remarried and I took my stepfather's name. Barrett." Penelope whispered the name, memory stirring. "There was a Lieutenant Barrett. My father spoke of him sometimes. He saved my father's life at Gettysburg." Kade nodded. "And your father saved his at Antietam. They remained correspondents for years afterward. When I learned of your parents' passing, I tried to find you, but the letters were returned. It wasn't until last year that I discovered you were still in Sweetwater Creek." "You came here because of my father." Penelope's mind raced, trying to make sense of this revelation. "I came here because my father would have wanted me to ensure his friend's daughter was well, to offer assistance if needed." Kade took a step toward her. "But I stayed because of you, Penelope." "Only you." The coffee pot began to whistle, but Penelope scarcely heard it. "Why didn't you tell me this when you first arrived? Would you have believed me? A stranger claiming a connection to parents you'd recently lost." He shook his head. "I wanted to observe first to see if you needed help to find the right moment to approach you. So the auction. Was that your idea of the right moment?" Despite herself, a smile tugged at her lips. "It wasn't planned," he admitted. "But when I saw you standing there, facing their mockery with such dignity, I couldn't stay silent any longer." Penelope moved to take the coffee pot off the heat, needing a moment to process his words. When she turned back to him, Kade had moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "Are you angry?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied honestly. "Surprised, confused, but not angry. I didn't bid on you out of obligation or pity, Penelope. I need you to understand that." "Then why did you?" "Because in 3 months of watching you from afar, I've come to admire your strength, your kindness, your quiet grace. Because when I look at you, I see a woman I want to know better, much better." His voice dropped lower. "Because from the moment I arrived in Sweetwater Creek, you're the only person who's felt real to me." The space between them seemed charged with electricity. Penelope's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll allow me to call on you properly. Say you'll give me a chance to earn your trust and perhaps, in time, something more." Penelope looked up at him, this man who had entered her life like a whirlwind and upended everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. "Yes," she said simply. The smile that broke across Kade's face transformed him, erasing the solemnity that usually marked his features. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he raised a hand to cup her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her lips. In answer, Penelope closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened as Kade's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. She had never been kissed before, had never expected to experience the rush of heat and tenderness that now flooded through her. When they finally parted, both breathless, Kade rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he murmured, "before your reputation suffers further." "Let them talk," Penelope replied with newfound boldness. "They will anyway." Kade chuckled, the sound vibrating through her. "Indeed they will. But I intend to court you properly, Penelope Thorne. That means respecting certain proprieties." He stepped back reluctantly, though he kept hold of her hands. "I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon if that's agreeable." "It is," she nodded, already missing his warmth. At the door, he kissed her once more, briefly but with unmistakable promise. "Sweet dreams, Penelope." Long after he had gone, Penelope stood in her small cottage, touching her fingers to lips that still tingled from his kiss, wondering if it was possible to die from happiness. True to his word, Kade called on Penelope the next afternoon, and the next, and the next. Over the following weeks, Sweetwater Creek buzzed with gossip about the unexpected courtship. Some predicted it would fizzle out quickly, that Kade Blackwell would soon tire of plain Penelope Thorne. Others whispered that he must have ulterior motives. Perhaps he was after the small plot of land her cottage stood on, or using her to improve his standing in the community. Penelope heard the rumors. Of course, Mabel Watson made certain of that, stopping by the seamstress shop frequently with thinly veiled insinuations disguised as concern. But for the first time in her life, Penelope found she didn't care what others thought. Because Kade showed her with every word and action that his interest was genuine. He brought her wildflowers gathered from his land. He shared meals with her, sometimes at her cottage, sometimes at the small restaurant in town where he insisted on escorting her proudly through the front door. He told her stories of his childhood in Texas, of his time as a marshal, of his dreams for his ranch. And he listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her parents, her work, her own quiet dreams that she had buried deep after their deaths. "You could still open that dress shop of your own," he told her one evening as they sat on her porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Your talent is wasted working for Mrs. Hollister." "Perhaps someday," Penelope replied, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "But it requires capital I don't have. I could help with that." She straightened, looking at him with a frown. "I don't want your charity, Kade, not charity, an investment." His eyes held hers steadily. "I believe in you, Penelope. I've seen your work. You have a gift that deserves to be shared beyond this small town." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. How strange it was to have someone believe in her abilities, to see potential where she had long ago resigned herself to limitation. "I'll think about it," she promised. As summer ripened into early fall, their courtship deepened. Kade took her to see his ranch, 500 acres of good grazing land with a modest but solid house he was in the process of expanding. He showed her the improvements he was making. A larger kitchen, a covered porch that wrapped around two sides of the house, a second bedroom that he described as for the future, with a meaningful look that made Penelope blush. In turn, she shared with him her most treasured possessions. Her mother's Bible with family births and deaths recorded in fading ink. Her father's pocket watch that no longer kept time but still opened to reveal a tiny portrait of her mother inside. The quilt her grandmother had made for her 16th birthday. Small intimacies accumulated between them. The brush of his hand against hers as they walked, the way he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, stolen kisses that grew increasingly passionate. Penelope discovered desires she had never allowed herself to acknowledge, and Kade was both patient and ardent in showing her how deeply he wanted her, while still respecting the boundaries of propriety. It was on a golden October afternoon, nearly 3 months after the bachelor auction, that Kade invited Penelope to ride with him to a special spot on his property. "There's something I want to show you," he said mysteriously, helping her onto his gentle mare while he rode his stallion alongside. They followed a creek that cut through his land, the water sparkling in the autumn sunlight. Cottonwood trees lined the banks, their leaves beginning to turn yellow with the changing season. After about 20 minutes, they crested a small rise, and Penelope gasped at what lay before them. A natural clearing opened up, carpeted with late wildflowers. At its center stood an enormous oak tree, its branches spreading wide to create a canopy of dappled shade. A small stream fed into a crystal-clear pool before continuing on its way down the hillside. "It's beautiful," Penelope breathed as Kade helped her dismount. "I found it my first week here," he said, tethering the horses to a nearby sapling. "I come here to think sometimes." He took her hand, leading her to the base of the great oak. A blanket had been spread there along with a picnic basket. "You planned this," she observed, smiling. "I did." He gestured for her to sit, and he joined her on the blanket. From the basket, he produced bread, cheese, apples, and a bottle of wine. They ate companionably, talking of small things, the preparations for winter at the ranch, the latest order Penelope was working on for Mrs. Hollister, Sheriff Miller's recent announcement of his retirement. After they had finished eating, Kade grew quiet, a tension in his shoulders that Penelope had come to recognize when he was working himself up to say something important. "What is it?" she asked gently. He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Penelope, these past months have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," she whispered, her heart beginning to race. "When I came to Sweetwater Creek, I was empty, lost. I had a purpose to find you, to fulfill what I saw as an obligation to your father and mine, but no real direction beyond that." He raised his eyes to hers. "I never expected to find so much more." Kade shifted, reaching into his pocket. "I had a whole speech prepared, but now that I'm here with you, words seem inadequate." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Penelope's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a ring, a delicate gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," Kade said softly. "Before that, it belonged to my grandmother. I've carried it with me for 10 years, waiting for the day I might give it to someone who would understand its value." He took the ring from the box, holding it between them. "Penelope Thorne, I love you. Your strength, your kindness, your quiet dignity, the way you see beauty in small things, the way you've opened your heart to me despite every reason to be cautious." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes as he continued. "I want to build a life with you here, on this land, in a home filled with love and respect. I want to wake beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Penelope couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. All her life, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, to a life lived on the margins of other people's happiness. Now this man, this remarkable, kind, passionate man, was offering her everything she had never dared to dream of. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Kade, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Kade drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise contained in his proposal. When they broke apart, both breathless, Penelope looked down at the ring on her finger, hardly able to believe this wasn't a dream. "When?" she asked. "When would you want to? Tomorrow, if you'd agree to it," Kade replied with a laugh. "But I suspect the good people of Sweetwater Creek would appreciate a proper wedding to gossip about. Christmas," Penelope decided suddenly. "Let's marry at Christmas." "Christmas it is," he agreed, pulling her close again. 2 months to prepare and then you'll be Mrs. Kade Blackwell." As they rode back to town that evening, Penelope's mind whirled with plans and possibilities. Mrs. Hollister would help with her wedding dress, of course. They would need to speak with Reverend Porter about the ceremony. And there was her cottage to consider should she sell it. Rent it out. But beneath the practical considerations lay a deeper joy that seemed to illuminate her from within. For the first time in her life, Penelope felt not just seen but cherished, not just accepted but desired. Kade Blackwell had looked past her plain exterior to the woman beneath, and in his eyes, she had discovered her own worth. News of their engagement spread through Sweetwater Creek like wildfire. By the following morning, it seemed everyone in town had heard, and reactions were predictably mixed. Some, like Mrs. Hollister, offered sincere congratulations. Others, like Mabel Watson, couldn't quite hide their confusion and skepticism behind their smiles. "Well, my dear, this is certainly unexpected," Mabel said when she cornered Penelope outside the mercantile. "Such a whirlwind romance. One hopes Mr. Blackwell knows what he's doing." "I assure you, Mrs. Watson, we both know exactly what we're doing," Penelope replied with a serenity that surprised even herself. As the weeks passed, preparations for the wedding progressed. Mrs. Hollister outdid herself with Penelope's gown, ivory satin with delicate lace overlay, modest but elegant. Kade arranged for his ranch house renovations to be completed before Christmas, working alongside his hired men to ensure everything would be perfect for his bride. They decided the ceremony would be held in the small church on Christmas Eve, followed by a reception at the town hall. Despite having few close friends, Penelope found herself touched by how many townspeople offered to help with preparations, the same people who had barely acknowledged her existence before Kade came into her life. "It's amazing how quickly people change their tune," she observed to Kade one evening as they reviewed the growing guest list. "People respect success and happiness," he replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You have both now and they're drawn to it. Because of you. No, my love. Because they're finally seeing what was always there." He kissed her forehead. "I just had the good sense to look first." The day before their wedding, a surprise snowfall blanketed Sweetwater Creek in white, transforming the dusty town into a glistening wonderland. Penelope stood at her cottage window, watching the flakes drift down in the golden light of the setting sun, and felt as if nature itself was blessing their union. A knock at the door roused her from her reverie. Opening it, she found Mrs. Hollister on her porch, arms laden with parcels. "Final fitting," the dressmaker announced, bustling inside. "Can't have anything less than perfection for tomorrow." As Mrs. Hollister helped Penelope into the wedding gown for the last time, making minute adjustments to the hem and sleeves, the older woman's usually brusque manner softened. "I never had a daughter," she said suddenly, her fingers deftly working a needle through delicate fabric. "Always wished for one, but it wasn't to be." Penelope looked at her in surprise. Mrs. Hollister rarely spoke of personal matters. "These past 4 years watching you work. Well." The dressmaker cleared her throat. "You've done me proud, Penelope, and your parents would be proud too, seeing the woman you've become." Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollister, for everything." The older woman nodded briskly, returning to her professional demeanor. Yes, well, that should do it. Now, remember what I told you about the bustle. Don't let anyone step on it during the dancing. Later that night, alone in her cottage for the last time, Penelope found she couldn't sleep. Tomorrow she would become Kade's wife. Tomorrow her life would change irrevocably. She wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped onto her porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a pristine blanket that glittered in the moonlight. In the distance, she could see the spire of the church where she would make her vows. "Are you watching, Mother? Father?" she whispered to the stars. "I think you would have liked him." A sense of peace settled over her, as if they had indeed heard and approved. Penelope smiled, hugging herself against the chill. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The church was filled to capacity on Christmas Eve. Penelope stood in the small antechamber, trying to calm her racing heart as she listened to the murmur of voices beyond the door. Mrs. Hollister fussed with her veil one last time, then stepped back to survey her work. "Perfect," she pronounced. "He won't know what hit him." Sheriff Miller, who had agreed to give Penelope away in lieu of her father, appeared at the door. "It's time," he said, his weather-beaten face creasing in a rare smile. "You look beautiful, Miss Thorne." The wedding march began, played on the church's small organ. Mrs. Hollister slipped out to take her seat, and Sheriff Miller offered his arm. "Ready?" he asked. Penelope took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." The doors opened, and the congregation rose to their feet. Penelope's gaze traveled down the aisle to where Kade stood waiting for her, his expression one of such naked adoration that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Step by step, she moved toward her future, barely aware of the faces watching her passage. All she could see was Kade standing tall and handsome in his black suit, his eyes never leaving hers. When she reached him, Sheriff Miller placed her hand in Kade's and stepped back. Kade squeezed her fingers gently, his touch steadying her. "You're breathtaking," he whispered for her ears alone. Reverend Porter began the ceremony, his voice ringing out in the hushed church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Penelope, familiar from countless weddings she had attended but never expected to experience herself. When it came time for their vows, Kade's voice was clear and confident, his promises to love, honor, and cherish her ringing with sincerity. When her turn came, Penelope's voice trembled slightly but grew stronger with each word. "I, Penelope Thorne, take thee, Kade Blackwell, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward." The exchange of rings, the pronouncement, the kiss, each moment imprinted itself on Penelope's heart with crystalline clarity. And then they were turning to face the congregation as Reverend Porter announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Kade Blackwell." The church erupted in applause as Kade led Penelope back down the aisle, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. Outside, the winter sun shone brilliantly on the snow-covered landscape, and friends showered them with rice as they emerged. The reception that followed was a blur of congratulations, dancing, and laughter. The town hall had been transformed with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and hundreds of candles in honor of both Christmas and the wedding. The orchestra played tirelessly, and the tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by nearly every household in Sweetwater Creek. "I never imagined so many people would come," Penelope murmured to Kade as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Everyone loves a celebration," he replied, guiding her effortlessly across the floor. "And a love story. Is that what we are, a love story, the best kind?" His eyes crinkled with his smile. "The kind where the hero recognizes the heroine's worth when others are blind to it, And they live happily ever after, she teased. That part we get to write together, Mrs. Blackwell. He pulled her closer, propriety be damned. Starting tonight. As evening fell, they made their farewells and departed for the ranch, their home now. Kade had arranged for a closed carriage decorated with ribbons and bells, the interior lined with warm blankets against the winter chill. As they left the town behind, Penelope leaned against her husband's shoulder, a profound contentment settling over her. Happy? Kade asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Beyond words, she replied honestly. The ranch house was aglow with lamplight when they arrived, a welcoming beacon in the darkness. Kade surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwell, he said, setting her down gently in the entryway. Penelope turned in a slow circle, taking in the comfortable furnishings, the crackling fire in the hearth, the Christmas pine decorated with popcorn strings and paper ornaments that she recognized as her own handiwork from weeks before. It's perfect, she whispered. Kade came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. There's more, he murmured against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. I have a wedding present for you. Taking her hand, he led her to a door off the main room that she hadn't noticed before. Close your eyes, he instructed. Penelope complied, hearing the creak of the door opening. Kade guided her forward a few steps, then stopped. You can look now. She opened her eyes and gasped. Before her was a room flooded with the last rays of sunset streaming through large windows. Along one wall ran a counter with a brand-new sewing machine, the latest model she'd admired in the mercantile catalog, but could never afford. Shelves lined another wall, stocked with bolts of fabric in every color and texture imaginable. A large cutting table occupied the center of the room, and a comfortable chair sat in the corner beside a small bookcase filled with fashion plates and pattern books. Your workroom, Kade said softly. For when you're ready to start your own designs. Tears flowed freely down Penelope's cheeks as she turned to him. How did you, Sheriff Miller, help me transport everything while you were busy with wedding preparations? He explained. Mrs. Hollister advised on the supplies you would need. It's too much, Penelope protested weakly, even as her fingers itched to explore the treasures before her. Nothing is too much for you. Kade gently wiped away her tears with his thumbs. This is just the beginning, Penelope. I want to give you everything you've been denied, everything you deserve. She raised herself on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the embrace. When they finally separated, both breathless, Kade's eyes had darkened with desire. There's one more room I'd like to show you, he said, his voice husky. Our bedroom. Heat bloomed in Penelope's cheeks, but she nodded, allowing him to lead her back through the house to the master bedroom. Here, too, he had thought of everything: a large four-poster bed with fresh linens, a dressing table with a silver brush set, a washstand with warm water already prepared. I'll give you a few minutes, Kade said, brushing his lips against her forehead before retreating to the door. Take all the time you need. Alone, Penelope took several deep breaths to calm her racing heart. Despite her inexperience, she found she wasn't afraid, not with Kade. From their first kiss, he had awakened desires in her that she had never allowed herself to acknowledge, and she trusted him completely to guide her in this most intimate of dances. With trembling fingers, she removed her wedding gown, carefully laying it across a chair. Mrs. Hollister had provided a silk nightgown and robe for her wedding night, both in a pale green that reminded Penelope of the dress she'd worn to the Founder's Day dance. She brushed out her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back, then slipped into the nightgown. The silk felt cool and sensuous against her skin. After a moment's hesitation, she left the robe on the bed and moved to the door. "Kade," she called softly. He appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting just outside. He'd removed his jacket and tie, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a tantalizing glimpse of his chest. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of her, hair loose, clad only in the thin silk that did little to disguise her figure. "You are so beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So are you," she replied honestly. He crossed to her in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms. His kiss was hungry now, possessive, and Penelope responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. Kade lifted her easily, carrying her to the bed and laying her down with infinite care. As he stretched out beside her, his hand caressed her cheek, her neck, the curve of her shoulder. "I love you, Penelope," he whispered against her lips. "I will spend the rest of my life showing you how much." "Show me now," she breathed, pulling him closer. And as snow began to fall again outside their window, Kade Blackwell taught his wife the language of love, tender and passionate, gentle and fierce, a communion of bodies and souls that transcended words. In his arms, Penelope discovered the final piece of herself that had been missing, and knew at last what it meant to be truly, completely loved. 5 years later, Penelope sat on the wide porch of their ranch house, watching as Kade chased their 3-year-old son James across the yard. The boy's delighted squeals echoed in the clear summer air, matched by the gurgling laughter of 9-month-old Elizabeth, who bounced on Penelope's lap. "Careful, Jonathan," Penelope called as their older son, 4.5 and the image of his father, attempted to climb the corral fence to get a better view of the new foal born the previous week. Kade scooped up James and swung him onto his shoulders before moving to lift Jonathan down from the fence. "Listen to your mother, boys," he admonished with a wink in Penelope's direction. "She's the boss around here." Penelope smiled, adjusting Elizabeth's sunbonnet. Their daughter had inherited her auburn hair, and according to Kade, her spirit, which was a polite way of saying she was stubborn as a mule even before she could walk. The ranch had prospered under Kade's careful management, expanding to nearly 1,000 acres with a growing herd of cattle and several prized horses. Penelope's dress shop in town, Thorne Designs, had become equally successful, with orders coming in from as far away as Tucson and Phoenix for her elegant, practical creations. Mrs. Hollister had retired 2 years earlier, selling Penelope her building and inventory for a fraction of their worth, insisting it was a business decision rather than a gift. The elderly dressmaker now spent most afternoons in the back room of the shop, ostensibly to offer advice but really to dote on the Blackwell children when they accompanied their mother to work. Sweetwater Creek itself had grown, the railroad having finally reached them the previous year. New businesses had opened, new families had moved in, and the once dusty town was slowly transforming into a proper city. Through it all, Penelope and Kade had remained at its heart respected, admired, and in Penelope's case, no longer overlooked or dismissed. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Blackwell?" Kade asked, climbing the porch steps with a boy on each hip. "How fortunate I am," she replied honestly. He set the boys down, sending them off to play with their wooden horses on the other end of the porch. Taking a seat beside Penelope, he gently lifted Elizabeth from her arms, settling the baby against his broad chest where she immediately began to doze. "I'm the fortunate one," he countered, leaning over to kiss Penelope softly. 5 years, 3 children, and you still take my breath away every time I look at you." "Flatterer," she teased, though the compliment warmed her as it always did. "Simple truth." He captured her hand, bringing it to his lips. The pearl ring he'd given her glinted in the sunlight, joined now by a gold wedding band and a diamond eternity ring he'd surprised her with after Jonathan's birth. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. "The bachelor auction." "Often," he admitted. "Best impulsive decision I ever made." Penelope laughed softly. "You weren't supposed to be up for auction at all. Neither were you, if truth be told. You were supposed to bid on the men, not be bid upon yourself. I'm glad you broke the rules." Kade smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. At 35, he was even more handsome than when they'd first met, the passing years adding character to his features without diminishing his vitality. "I'd break every rule in the book for you, Penelope Blackwell." His voice dropped lower, his eyes darkening with a promise that still made her pulse quicken after all this time. "And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." From the yard came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Kade handed the sleeping Elizabeth back to Penelope and rose to his feet, shading his eyes against the sun. "It's Tommy Jenkins," he announced as the rider came into view. "Wonder what brings him out this way." Tommy had matured into a competent blacksmith after his father's death 2 years earlier. His stutter had improved with age, and while his face would always bear the scars of his childhood accident, his shy smile had become a more frequent sight around town. "Mr. Blackwell, Mrs. Blackwell," Tommy greeted them, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Beautiful day." "Indeed it is, Tommy," Penelope smiled. "What brings you to our corner of the world?" Tommy's face flushed slightly. "Got a telegram for you from Phoenix. Thought it might be important, so I offered to bring it out rather than waiting for you to come to town." Kade descended the steps to take the yellow envelope Tommy extended. "Much appreciated." While Kade opened the telegram, Penelope invited Tommy to stay for lemonade, which he accepted gratefully, mopping his brow in the summer heat. "Good news?" she asked when she saw Kade's wide smile as he read the message. "The best," he confirmed, climbing the steps again to hand her the telegram. "Governors approved our petition for the school funding. Construction can begin next month." Penelope scanned the words with growing excitement. For the past year, she and Kade had been working to establish a proper school in Sweetwater Creek, one that would serve all children in the area, regardless of their background or circumstances. The current one-room schoolhouse was woefully inadequate for the growing population. "That's wonderful," she exclaimed, passing the telegram back to Kade. "Congratulations," Tommy said, accepting a glass of lemonade from Penelope. "The whole town's behind you on this one." "Not the whole town," Kade corrected with a wry smile. "Mayor Wilkins still thinks it's an unnecessary expense." Tommy snorted. "Mayor Wilkins still thinks indoor plumbing is an unnecessary expense." They all laughed, including the boys who had wandered over to see what the excitement was about. "Are you building us a new school, Papa?" Jonathan asked, climbing onto his father's lap. "Not just for you, son," Kade replied, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "For all the children of Sweetwater Creek and for those who come after you." Penelope watched her husband with their children, her heart full to bursting. From that first day at the bachelor auction to this moment, Kade had never stopped surprising her with his generosity, his vision, his capacity for love. He had given her not just a family and a home, but a sense of purpose and belonging she had never thought possible. After Tommy departed with their reply to the governor, the family settled into their evening routine supper on the porch to catch the cooling breeze, baths for the children, bedtime stories, and finally quiet as the little ones drifted off to sleep. Later, as Penelope and Kade lay in their bed, the windows open to admit the night air scented with sage and pine, She curled against his side and traced idle patterns on his chest. "Happy?" he asked, just as he had on their wedding night and countless nights since. "Completely," she answered truthfully. Kade pressed a kiss to her forehead, his arm tightening around her. "Do you remember what you said to me that night after the auction, when I asked what would happen the next day? That I would go back to being overlooked," Penelope recalled. "I was so certain that whatever spell you had cast would break in the light of day. And now," she raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, at the beloved face that had become the center of her world. "Now I know better. You didn't cast a spell, Kade. You simply really saw me when no one else bothered to look." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "From the moment I first saw you, Penelope, you were the only one I could see clearly. Everything else was just background." She bent to kiss him, slow and sweet. "I love you, Kade Blackwell. More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow. And I love you, Penelope Blackwell." His eyes shone in the moonlight filtering through the window, until the stars burn out and beyond. As they came together in the familiar dance of passion and tenderness, Penelope marveled at how far they had come from that day in the town square. From a woman who believed no one would choose her to a wife, mother, business owner, and community leader. From a lonely existence on the margins to a life overflowing with love and purpose. All because one man had looked past appearances and expectations to see the treasure others had overlooked. All because, in the moment when laughter threatened and humiliation loomed, Kade Blackwell had stood up and claimed her before the entire town. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of recognition of her true worth, a worth she had finally, joyfully come to see in herself. And as dawn broke over the ranch the next morning, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Penelope Blackwell watched her husband and children from the porch steps, and knew with absolute certainty that she had found her happily ever after, a love story more beautiful than any she could have imagined, written day by day in the steadfast devotion of a man who had chosen her when no one else would.